Hi, everybody.
Hi, good afternoon, good morning.
Hello.
Hello. So welcome to our session, Social and Corporate Responsibility. I'm very excited about our program today, and I wanted to just briefly talk about the structure of the session for a second. We're going to have two presenters, two academic presenters. First, Liz Barnes from Manchester Metropolitan University, and then we'll have Kevin Colbin from Rutgers Business School. Following both of those sessions, which will be roughly 15 minutes each, we will hear remarks from our industry panelist, Nathan Fleissig, for roughly 10 minutes. And attendee mics are muted because we're in webinar format. So if you do have questions during the session, please write them out in the Q&A, and I will try to take a few of them here, okay? And I'll ask them when I think that we can interrupt, probably after each of the speakers are done speaking. However, any remaining questions can be carried over or asked in person in the breakout sessions immediately following this session. So there will be a breakout session for this session. It's dedicated for this one at 11 a.m. And at that time, we'll move into Zoom meetings. And again, everybody can have their cameras on. So with that, let's begin. So we have Liz Barnes from Manchester Metropolitan University talking about fashion in lockdown.
Thanks, Tavi. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk today. I met Tavi a few years ago and she introduced me to the Centre for Fashion Business, and I've been wanting to get more involved ever since, but we haven't ever really been able to make the dates work previously. Now that we all find ourselves having to work remotely, it's one of the few things that's actually been easier to do. And so I'm really pleased to be here today, albeit remotely. I'm a professor of fashion marketing and also head of Manchester Fashion Institute at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. Manchester Fashion Institute is one of the largest fashion schools in the UK. We have around 2,000 students at undergraduate and postgraduate across a range of fashion disciplines, from design, technology, communications, through to marketing and business management. My research interest has mainly been concerned with fast fashion and marketing communication, and to some extent, that's the lens through which I'm going to present today. But inevitably, as head of a large department, I can't help but also bring fashion education into the mix. So I hope you'll forgive me for what might seem a somewhat unconventional research presentation. I discussed potential research topics that I could go over today with Tavi in preparation for the event. And we settled on some research that I've been exploring, focusing on the impact of the pandemic on the fashion industry in the UK. And it's in preparation for it to be included in a new book that I'm co-authoring with one of my colleagues, Dr. Helen McCormick, on fashion brand management. The title of today's presentation is Fashion in Lockdown, with a question mark at the end of it. And the question mark is important because, of course, there have been winners and losers across the industry as a result of the pandemic. And I'll explore some of this further in my presentation. Some of the themes were picked up in the previous session, and I'll talk to some of those, especially around things like agility and being able to react quickly. And then there are some of the other presentations from Nathan and from Kevin in this session that also take forward some of the things that I'll be talking about, particularly in terms of things like labour rights. So our research is looking at a wide range of all of the things that have come up as a result of the pandemic. And of course, we know that there are many of them. We've only really got a narrow context to report on so far, and I'll do that later in the presentation. But much of it's happening now, and so we're kind of researching as it happens. And so I hope that you can forgive me, and that a lot of what I've got to talk about today remains a bit of a work in progress rather than a finished article. Of course, the pandemic is absolutely an unprecedented event in modern times, and there have been many obvious ways in which our industry has been affected, both positively and negatively. Almost no part of the industry is untouched by the impact. So from an academic research point of view, there's masses of potential to explore across consumption, supply chain, product development, trends, and so on, but also thinking about the content of our book and thinking as educators. Perhaps there's no better example as to how profound the impact of an event entirely beyond the control of any business can have on a brand. So let's run through some of the examples of how the pandemic has impacted fashion. The most obvious example is the lockdown, meaning we've all been working from home, and without the requirement to dress for the workplace, we've spent the last 6 months in sportswear and loungewear. So there's been a huge shift in demand. I mean, who would ever have imagined that we'd see Anna Wintour wearing joggers at work? By the summer, sales of loungewear in the UK were up 49% year on year. And those retailers who have been able to flex their supply chains to respond to that change in demand have been the winners. So for example, British fashion brand Coast, once known for their formal wear, recently brought out by fast fashion giant Boohoo, managed to get a whole new loungewear range into stores by April this year, and thus capitalised on the shift in trends. This agile response would have once been impossible for a retailer like Coast. They'd once been bound by the traditional seasonal approach to range development that ultimately led to its demise and being snapped out of administration by Boohoo. And here they were, agile with their new loungewear range. You know something's major when one of the Kardashian tribe are posting about it. And during a time when they can't post about their latest trips abroad or their nights out, they're influencing trends by posting about comfy loungewear. So it's changing marketing communications. It's changing the way that influencers are working. It isn't just what we wear that's changed as the result of the pandemic. In fashion education, we had to flip all of our end of year live shows into digital events and portfolios, reflecting, of course, what's happened with fashion weeks around the world. Here in Manchester Fashion Institute, we also contributed to the national effort in lockdown, putting our fashion pattern cutting and garment technology skills, as well as our links with local industry to good use in the challenge that we faced around PPE shortages for medical staff at the height of the pandemic. So the pandemic has changed fashion consumption, fashion marketing communications, fashion trends, fashion education. It's separated the winners from the losers in terms of those brands who can truly have agile supply chains and be fast fashion in every sense of the word. Of course, these have been some of the more positive or light-hearted aspects of fashion in lockdown. The impact of the pandemic has also shone a very harsh light on some of the realities of the fashion industry. The fact that so much can be done remotely or digitally has forced us to question the need for mass business travel. Can there ever be a justifiable reason for us to travel to fashion weeks across the world to encourage overconsumption, or for buyers and garment techs to make multiple visits to overseas factories when we know now how much development work can be done remotely? We know many small and large retailers face huge challenges to remain viable as countries go into deep lockdown. And the impact on the environment of our overconsumption and polluting industry and fashion's role in that has been questioned. The crisis and the lockdown have given us all time to reflect on waste and excess. Of course, our young people are leading the way on this agenda, and I can't help but showcase our graduate of 2020, Sophie Parnaby, who's just been announced as the London Graduate Fashion Week winner of 2 awards, Considered Fashion and Fashion Innovation, for her work on using 3D printing for sustainable embellishment as an alternative to the use of highly polluting sequin embellishments. Environmental concerns weren't the only thing that the fashion industry has been forced to reflect on during the lockdown. Race, female empowerment, gender identity, and body positivity are all issues that have re-emerged during lockdown and forced the fashion industry to rethink. And so there's much to explore from a research point of view when it comes to fashion in lockdown. One of the most disturbing reports to hit the headlines in the UK was the emergence of fast fashion manufacturers' use of sweatshops. Of course, you don't have to be an expert to know that the fashion industry has long been associated with the use of so-called sweatshops. And we typically associate that with big bad Western brands taking advantage of low-paid workers in poorer countries of Asia and South America. However, those in the industry are mostly in the know that this isn't just an offshore manufacturing problem, and domestic manufacturing issues have been a concern for years now. But the pandemic has put the industry under scrutiny once more, and this time shining a light very much on our own doorstep. In this case, the brand under scrutiny was Boohoo, a UK fast fashion juggernaut. Launched in 2006, it's currently valued at close to £5 billion, which I think is about $6.5 million, and remains one of the fastest growing fast fashion retailers in the world. Concerns emerged during the lockdown about its use of a number of factories in Leicester in the UK, with accusations ranging from their use of undocumented or illegal workers and links to modern slavery and low pay. But emerging as a direct result of the pandemic and lockdown, a new string to the sweatshop bow, making workers work even when displaying symptoms of coronavirus. These workers were often undocumented and therefore not entitled to any support from the welfare state. And so with no sick pay, they were first forced to work even when ill with coronavirus. Working conditions were not COVID safe. There was a lack of social distancing, no PPE in place to protect any of the employees, and pressure very much applied to those workers to continue working to meet the demands of the fashion brands they were supplying. So this prompted further examination as part of a wider research agenda to look broadly at the impact of the pandemic and lockdown on fashion brands, and in particular at addressing some of the aspects specifically relating to social responsibility. So taking this forward in an academic context, the research agenda intersects a number of perspectives and gives rise to a number of research questions. So starting at its broadest, how has the pandemic impacted fashion brands? And then with a little more focus, thinking, how has the pandemic changed fast fashion? Has it impacted fast fashion more than other sectors of fashion retail? Has lockdown given rise to a new dimension of working practices that we need to consider as part of that social responsibility agenda? Has anything really changed in fast fashion supply chains, despite years of concern about CSR? How has the impact of the pandemic influenced fashion consumer behaviour? And how do consumer CSR concerns impact fast fashion brands? And so although we're embarking on this broader set of research projects across each of these questions, the narrow focus I want to discuss today arises from this final research question. How do consumer CSR concerns impact fashion brands? So referencing the earlier slides, the pandemic has offered both positive and negative issues for fast fashion brands. On the one hand, trends have changed quickly and fast fashion brands have been able to capitalise on that. And given many of them are also online retailers, they've also been able to take full advantage of consumers being in lockdown at home and only able to buy online. But the disposal nature of their product, high fashion but very low price, enabling consumers to continually buy into the next new trend, combined with the pressure through the supply chain to deliver at low costs and rapidly, and consequently the potential for the use of sweatshops, have put this sector of the industry front and centre in this COVID world. In terms of the academic literature, in order to examine this research question, it intersects two bodies of literature: fast fashion supply chains and corporate social responsibility. I first started publishing on fast fashion back in the early 2000s. Back then it was the sector buzzword after Zara's entrance to the market, and so it piqued my interest, and myself and co-writer Gaynor Lee Greenwood were the first to really conceptualise it in academic theory, and you can see here our definition. Of course, since then, we know this model has become entirely commonplace and cross-sects the whole fashion industry. And whilst the approaches can be really quite different, for example, from the sort of online, low price, high volume, high fashion model adopted by the likes of Boohoo, ASOS and Misguided, through to luxury brands like Chanel and Gucci with their cruise or capsule collections, designed to keep their ranges refreshed and exciting. But the commonality across all fashion supply chains is the need for speed and agility. But it's this combination of overconsumption and pressure on supply chains that has the potential to expose fast fashion with the additional pressures caused by the pandemic laid bare. So this combination of overconsumption of cheap disposable fashion has been cited as the cause for clogging our landfill, and the need for low-cost garments manufactured under incredibly tight delivery deadlines has inevitably led to questionable manufacturing practices, where child labour, forced labour, low pay and other practices are rife in the competition for who can do it quickest and cheapest. The impact of the pandemic has only heightened the pressures already faced in this sector of the industry, and new and unsavoury practices have emerged. This research also contributes to the reshoring debate. Although production in regions such as the Far East and the Indian subcontinent have long afforded the low cost that fashion brands demand, it is offset by the increased speed to market. In these demanding markets, where having the right trend at the right price separates the winners from the losers, remember the Coast loungewear example at the beginning, it can make more commercial sense to have the product at speed by having it produced locally despite paying more for it. In the UK, regional centres of apparel manufacturing have emerged, in particular Leicester and Manchester. Both cities with a long tradition in textile manufacturing, with old textile mills being readily available and repurposed for apparel production in the last few years. The other key feature in both cities, making them ripe for a resurgent clothing manufacturing industry, is a large immigrant workforce. Both areas are traditionally home to immigrants from Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, and in more recent times from Africa and Eastern Europe. But of course, this has also meant that there's huge potential for there to be an abuse of vulnerable and illegal workers, and thus why it's been relatively easy for these workers to have been taken advantage of in the pandemic. The discovery of these factories and their failure to safeguard both their own employees and their local communities from the spread of coronavirus caused a huge volume of negative press in the UK, and there have been various government task forces set up to investigate. But the question remains how issues like this influence consumers. This research also contributes to the CSR literature, in particular in how it expands the scope of CSR responsibilities to now include how businesses respond to these issues arising from a pandemic, which has not been such a widespread concern since the literature on CSR emerged in the 1960s. CSR has been around for many years, but after years of corporate window dressing of their approaches and responses to CSR, the powerful voice of consumers, driven largely but not exclusively by Generation Z, is changing consumer behaviour, and brands really are now responding more robustly to their CSR strategies. A report in 2019 by Marchetti found over 90% of Generation Z consumers expressed concern about fashion brands and a desire for brands to improve their CSR response. And many fashion brands have made genuine and concerted efforts to respond to that through their management of suppliers, the development of things like sustainable fabrics and other ethical practices. But now there's a new part of the CSR agenda, the safeguarding of workers in a pandemic. Having said all that, we know that Generation Z consumers are demanding. They want their brands to be socially responsible, but whilst delivering their cheap and high fashion, disposable, on-trend garments. So let's revisit the research question. How do consumer CSR concerns impact fast fashion brands? The one sort of bit of that broader research agenda that I talked to you about, where we have started to get some results, has been a particular piece of the research focused on the impact of the lockdown and emerging negative press that came from the use of these so-called sweatshops. We looked at how specifically how it was influencing graduates seeking employment in the industry. We know the competition for the best talent is fierce and the cost of the recruitment process significant for brands. So it's increasingly important that they develop the strategic advantage in the labour market. holding on to and motivating talent is reliant on there being shared values. And we know that graduates are highly concerned with the CSR agenda. So how did the lockdown impact their perception of current or potential employers, and in particular as the negative press associated with UK sweatshops emerged? So drawing on the literature from fast fashion and CSR, we derived a set of questions and took a qualitative approach to in-depth interviewing a sample of Generation Z graduates who were either actively seeking graduate employment in the fashion industry or were in roles they'd secured within 2 years of graduating. The research is very much in its early stages, and so these findings do need some further work, but they start to build a picture of how the impact of the pandemic and how it relates to a brand's CSR agenda. The respondents were well engaged with their employer's CSR strategy and activities, so they're readily able and able to talk about what their own organisations are engaged with in relation to CSR. They considered it to be the responsibility of the fashion brand they worked for to be actively doing the right thing. It was a minimum expectation. And that they shouldn't simply pay lip service to it, but should be actively and continually improving their CSR reputation and credibility. Employee activism, although acknowledging that they are part of a highly flawed industry, they felt engaged with their role in influencing change. So even when they were in the employee of one of the brands that had been affected by the negative press, they did feel that they still had a role in how they would influence from within. And I thought this was particularly interesting. But many of them remain highly sceptical of what their employers are really doing. This was less evident for those respondents working in the premium brand and luxury sectors, but greenwashing, recognition of brands' duplicity in their CSR activities, as well as shame and fury for those working for the brands associated with the pandemic sweatshops in Leicester, were all cited. A number of the respondents reported that they had purposely tried to gain work and employment with brands well aligned to their own values relating to CSR. But the reality was that for many, they had to put aside their own personal values in order to simply take a job in a very competitive labour market. So, in conclusion, to wrap up with some concluding thoughts and findings, there's no doubt that the impact of the pandemic has meant that the fashion industry has faced some scrutiny and that it's had wide-ranging implications across the sector. Fast fashion is ripe for re-examination from where I started all those years ago back in the early 2000s, but especially in relation to its intrinsic links to abuses of CSR. Our young people are well engaged with CSR and want to work for employers who share those values, and they see themselves as agents of change from within, but will often, and perhaps too frequently, have to put aside their own values in order to work in the industry they love. But how can this be sustainable? There's no doubt that there is long-term brand equity in having robustly defensible CSR records. And this is not only about customers, it also applies to an organisation's effective workforce. And finally, this research has identified, just catch up my slides there. This research has identified a potentially new dimension for CSR in the record of how businesses safeguard employees when faced with the commercial challenge of keeping up production in the shadow of a global pandemic. So I hope you found this presentation interesting. Thank you for listening. I'd be happy to take questions. I'm not sure whether you want to do that now or later on, Tavi. Over to you.
Thank you, Liz. That was truly fascinating. And I just wanted to remind everybody, this is just a small sliver of what Liz and her co-author cover in the book. And so I very much look forward to learning about the rest of it. I do have two very interesting questions from Matthew. I'm going to ask you, Matthew, for your patience. We're a little bit behind. So I'll try and take the questions at the very end of this session. And if not, I hope that you stick around so that you can ask them in person or we can read them for you in the breakout session. I apologize. Thank you, Liz. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Kevin Colbin, who is at Rutgers Business School in the supply chain department. His bio is up. He's also the vice chair of the supply chain department, and he will be talking about the consumer imaginary.
Thanks, Tavi. I'm going to share the screen here. 1 second. Thank you very much, Tavi, for inviting me to this session. And thank you, Liz. That was really interesting for me because we have a lot of synergies in what we're talking about. And as you'll see, I think the perspective of the issues of reshoring and bringing things back closer to the consumer, but then also the perspective of employees was interesting for me as well. Much of my work over the years has focused on questions. By the way, I'm a lawyer, so I'm in a supply chain department, but I actually do research on law. And the issues I've been looking at over the years have looked at really how we can use various regulatory tools, including trade law and trade agreements, to improve working conditions in global supply chains. And I've been particularly interested in examining how non-state tools, such as private forms of regulation along supply chains, or what we often think of as CSR, can interact with state regulatory instruments to create dynamic regimes of enforcement in situations where the state institutions don't necessarily meet the demands of global consumers or of global civil society or of citizens. So while doing this work, though, over the years, I've recognized that a critical factor in a number of the regulatory regimes that I've proposed were actually consumers. Yet, at least in the law literature, there's been very little focus on consumers or how consumers act and what the law can do to actually activate consumers and have them engage in kinds of consumption behaviors that we're trying to achieve through legal instruments, which are usually focusing on the state. So the way that I'd like to begin, here, there we go. And this is basically the order of what I like to talk about, so let's just get into it. So the way that I'd like to begin is, first of all, to introduce this idea of something called the consumer imaginary. And the consumer imaginary is how consumers conceptualize and imagine the human beings, the processes, and the labor that produce the goods that they consume. So the first thing I want to do is for you to think about that jacket that you put on today, or maybe, according to Liz, your sweatpants, when you walked out the door. Now try to imagine, I guess we didn't really walk out the door, so I have to rejigger this for our new life in the pandemic. But try to imagine the person, or more like it, the people who sewed that zipper onto it, people who cut the fabric, who stitched it together, and who boxed and shipped it. Have you ever met these people? Now, of course, we are a particular group of people, so many of you have, but have you ever met anyone who's actually worked in a garment factory, either here or somewhere else? And if not, how do you imagine those people, or more likely those women, to be? Are they married? Are they mothers? What kind of homes do they sleep in? And what does their workplace look like? What does it smell like? Now, think also for a moment about the cup of coffee, or maybe tea that you drank this morning. Can you picture the landscape of the plantation on which the coffee bushes grew? In your mind, form an image of the faces and the hands of the people who picked the raw coffee beans that eventually made it into your mug. What do you think were the working conditions of those people whom you now have a mental image of? So if you played along in that exercise and closed your eyes and had these sort of pictures in your head, you've engaged in what I just described as the consumer imaginary. That is, you created for yourself a narrative and a mental image of the producers and the origins of two distinct products, garments and coffee, that are staples for hundreds of millions of people, billions of people. Yet it's highly likely that you've never worked on a coffee farm, nor in a garment factory, and it's also likely that you've not had significant, if any, social contact with anyone who has. Nevertheless, it's quite possible that your consumption choices are steered, at least in part, by the ways in which you imagine or are made to imagine the context in which the goods you consume are produced, and how you imagine the producers of those goods to be. In fact, if you do make purchasing decisions based on those criteria, you would not be alone, as Liz was mentioning, and which I'm going to discuss a little bit as well. And a growing body of research suggests that consumers are increasingly taking into account the social and environmental context of the goods that they consume and make purchasing choices based on them. They're thus becoming not just consumers, but citizen consumers. And what I like to propose in this is that the law should help catalyze citizen consumers to improve labor conditions and human rights compliance in the global supply chain by triggering the consumer imaginary that I just described. Now, just so you know, this is based on a paper that actually was published in an international law journal. And so the paper itself is quite a bit longer. I'm obviously just going to try to cut into some of the essential elements. The first thing I want to talk about is, in order to achieve this goal, right, of trying to trigger the consumer imaginary and why this consumer imaginary, I think, is salient, the first thing we need to do is discuss some changes that have happened in the supply chain economy. And, you know, this is an idea, this is the notion of the citizen consumer. Here's this person picking up a jar of olives like we produced in some place where he doesn't live. And the first thing that we need to think about of what happens to the economy is what Richard Baldwin has called the great unbundling. And the unbundling is a result of two things, basically. One, three things: reduced tariffs, reduced transportation costs, and the development of information and communication technology. So in the first unbundling, there was a significant decrease in transportation costs and tariffs. We know these technologies. I'm not going to get into it too much. In the second unbundling, we see, in particular, and this is from 1980, a real rise in information and communication technologies. And this has been particularly salient in the garment industry, such that, as Liz said, we don't really have to even be visiting factories as much anymore because we're basically in real time having communication. And what this has also meant, and in addition, I just want to go through these fairly quickly, we can see that tariff rates over the years have just dramatically decreased. In 2016, the average US tariff rate was 5%, and we know obviously through various bilateral free trade agreements with a number of countries that are garment producers, those rates are often zero on many garment categories. We also see that just overall across the world, tariff rates have plummeted. And what this basically has led to, in part, is a great increase in trade volumes over time. Obviously, we see dips as there's recessions. But what it also has meant that increasingly trade has become increasingly outsourced, offshored, and spatially separated from consumption. And the lead firms that at one time been producing garments in-house have now basically outsourced production in places that are far removed from the consumer. And you know, the whole setup, what does Nike actually make? It makes nothing. It's a design and marketing firm. And that is the model, not just for Nike and in the garment industry, but across industries, right? Even Boeing basically has outsourced 70 to 80% of its 787 plane, which as we know now has led to a number of problems. The other thing that's happened is that with these changes is that these changes in the economy have also created numerous fissures, in the words of an economist, David Weil, as well as communal and economic disruptions. And one of the central fissures is that a defining feature of the supply chain is that the people who make our stuff are most often not direct employees of the companies from who we buy that stuff. And this has implications for the degree to which those retailers can and do take responsibility for the working conditions of supply chain workers. Yet very often those suppliers are located in countries whose labor laws are either de jure, actually in the law itself, or de facto, that is like in their enforcement, weaker than those in the home country of the lead firm. And most importantly, those laws may substantially diverge from the normative expectations of civil society and consumers. So we basically want the labor laws as consumers, we want the labor laws and the working conditions to be better than they are in those countries. And we know many of the examples of instances where this divergence, this gap between our expectations and the actual laws and working conditions have taken a toll, starting all the way back with the Kathy Lee Gifford scandal, Nike in the 90s, going up, of course, to the most recent instances of Rana Plaza. And what happens is that because of various new technologies and because of media coverage of these horrible events, Rana is the worst of them, but there have been a number, and Nathan is in this all the time. Basically, the news media has covered these stories, including Rana Plaza in particular, and you could see that viewers and readers were confronted at the time of Rana Plaza with countless images of rubble and dead workers, arguably blurring the line between newsworthiness and exploitation, right? The media took this and made it seem like two lovers were embraced and made a whole story out of it. Now, something somewhat distasteful about it, but it also serves a purpose to mobilize this consumer imaginary and make real what could have been extremely abstract. And what was interesting to me in particular is that after Rana Plaza, there'd been a new kind of activism from consumers around the world. This is one example of several. There's a website called Avaz, which basically is an online petition site that brings people from around the world who can e-sign petitions around various causes. This one was a letter directly to the Benetton CEO to get him to commit to contributing to a compensation fund for workers who had been hurt. Obviously, this is a private means of trying to do what typically a state probably should have done, which is providing compensation and payment to injured workers. But this gathered well over 1 million signatures. This was sort of a flash of, a while ago, and it's since quite surpassed us. So the question is, right, because if we're going to try to mobilize these consumers into action with the use of law, one question that we have to ask is to what degree do consumers actually care and what do they do? Now, a lot of this information I'm going to try to go through pretty quickly, but this isn't even the Gen Z consumers that Liz was talking about. This was generalized surveys. So in a set of surveys that were published in 2013 by Elliott and Freeman, one of their conclusions is that they're willing to pay more. Consumers are willing to pay more for products that they're told are made in good conditions. But of course, like most things, this is price contingent. Because those same consumers report a slight decreasing willingness to purchase products that are made in good conditions as the price increases. On the other hand, if you look on the right side, where consumers are told that a t-shirt is made in bad conditions, they report to be less willing to buy that t-shirt, even if given a discount on that item. And other survey research has also found extensive support among consumers, both in the US and Europe, for buying products that are made in ethical and sweatshop-free conditions. Some other research, Hertel et al. In some 2009 paper reported that 65% of respondents, this was in the US primarily, will pay $5 more for a sweater made in good conditions, and a third were willing to pay $10 or more. Over 75% were willing to pay 50 cents or more per pound for fair trade coffee, and more than 50% were willing to pay more than $1. In another important book that came out in 2013 by Stoll and Micheletti, looking at a number of surveys in Europe and actually as well as the US, there was a question: have you engaged in boycotting, or both? Now, just to be clear, boycott, we know what boycotting is. Boycotting is the active decision to buy products that are made in conditions that comport with your preferences and values. So we see Sweden, 31% said yes. Sweden, it was 60%. United States, 28%, and there are a number of countries in between. But those are surveys, and in some interesting experimental work, the scholars Heinmiller and Hiscox, in a paper
Sorry
called
to interrupt. I think we have 1 minute.
Okay, we'll do
sorry.
it quick though. So let me tie this up quickly so we can blow through the rest of the research. One thing quickly I just want to note is one of the most interesting papers is basically showed that in a situation where consumers are actually given are cued to have direct communication from workers indicating the quality of their workplace, of their working conditions, we find that there is actually much more response. So what this basically means to me, just around to sum this up, and I can get to the, I'm going to close this down, is a couple of things. So first of all, I think there's a lot of room to trigger consumer action in the private sphere from using public laws. And the way that I focus on, at least in the paper, but I'm now looking at other means as well, is first, one way we can do it is through trade and labor provisions. So for those of us who work in that, which is probably none of you, basically, if you can have a tool in a trade and labor provision in a bilateral agreement, one of our trading partners, that actually generates direct information for consumers to act, that would be more effective than what we have now. A second way is if we look at transparency laws. Increasingly, transparency laws are on the rise around the globe. And these basically mandate for certain forms of information disclosure. If we could do it in a way that was less technical and more in a way that actually facilitated direct information, direct communication with images and other kinds of forms of direct communication simulations between consumers and between consumers and producers, I think they'd be much more effective. So that's basically it.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And I am going to introduce Nathan Fleissig from Outer Stuff, who's going to talk for about 8 minutes. And he has something very interesting planned. And we're going to start the breakout room exactly 5 minutes late at 5 past. So we should be okay, because I definitely want to get to all of the questions. So Nathan?
Thank you for this invitation. I'll be brief here. I'm the Director of Corporate Social Responsibility at Outer Stuff. We have the license for Nike and Adidas, and those are a lot of names that I know has been mentioned so far. So I'm not going to show you pictures of Anna Wintour and the Kardashians. I'm going to go back and show you the 26th President of the United States. And it's interesting about what he said about the rights of workers to a living wage, reasonable hours of labor, to decent working conditions, and to freedom of thought and speech, industrial representation in return for his arduous toil to a worthy and decent life according to American standards. So this is after Teddy Roosevelt went to see all the sweatshops in New York City. This was his thought process. Now we move ahead, and just last week, we actually had the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman. A lot of you should know who he is, and basically he was famous for saying the social responsibility of business is actually to increase profits. And if these are social responsibilities, they are the social responsibilities of individuals, not of business. So even after all this time of Teddy Roosevelt, to him, he didn't learn anything from it. And even we're on the 50th anniversary, and we see that how Milton Friedman's thoughts are really not in line with what the laws are, what consumers want. So I just wanted to talk about for just 1 minute is...
Nathan, you're sharing the wrong screen. We just see where it's showing your web app. We're not seeing your presentation.
The whole time you didn't see it?
It's okay if you just move your other screen.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. So what we have here is, if in the United States you see that the median household income is going up, however, expenses have been going up as well. So what happens when the general consumers in the United States that make up these 46,000 stores, what is it that they're actually looking for in price? And it is at odds with corporate social responsibility. When you look at those stores, that's where people are shopping in the United States. Their expectations on the price point is still low. Are they actually really thinking about corporate social responsibility? And that Professor and I will, we always talk about, okay? Are these consumer buying habits in conflict with CSR? Does it matter to the consumer? Will they pay more? And I know the professor brought up some writings that he feels they will, but in the context of what the normal average USA retail environment is, we don't see that consumers are willing to pay more. However, how is the investment community looking at it? Are there advantages of investing in CSR and ESG? And we find that over the last 10 years, there really wasn't much of a difference between companies investing in sustainable companies versus regular companies. So let's talk about Bangladesh for a minute. What actually happened? We hear ever since COVID, every article is about Bangladesh. Vendor purchases have ordered, all orders have been canceled, shipments have been stopped. vendors are not paying the factories, which means the workers aren't getting paid. Okay, we have 1 million factory workers have been terminated and furloughed in Bangladesh, 75 in the world, 75% without even getting paid benefits. And these buyers mostly make up the EU, not even the United States. So according to the Workers' Rights Consortium, we see that some companies are doing a very good job at a commitment to pay for the orders, and some companies are just well behind and not paying for their orders. When you're not paying for orders, factories close down, workers don't get paid. So now we'll move over to China. We know that in Xinjiang, there's been a lot of in the news about this particular area of restricted access, unreliable information, and a lack of an effective remediation option for forced workers. Okay, we know that there's forced workers, torture, separation from families, and finally, the US took action on this. And as of July 31st, all companies will be prohibited from directly doing business in that area. That's a really big deal. Because with the lack of transparency in the China supply chain, we don't know as a manufacturer where our cotton is coming from and where our labor is coming from. So, and the US will actually have violations if they're found to have companies. And the Department of Labor has a website on who's been found to be in these areas. So what we did in the industry of the America Apparel and Footwear industry, the Fair Labor Association, many stakeholders have sort of come up with a template and a tool for somebody like a company like OuterStuff and me as the compliance manager start going out to our global suppliers and ask them these questions. Does your company know about anything that's going on there? And how we can learn more about it. Because in reality, we're the ones responsible for it. So let's just talk about Disney just for 1 second. What went wrong? It took 5 years to make, $200 million cost. And believe it or not, there was filming done in the Xinjiang province. And I gave you a map just for you to see how far away Xinjiang is compared to the normal area of manufacturing in China, which is along the eastern coast between Shanghai and Hong Kong. So it's a very difficult area to see what actually is being done there.
Nathan, Nathan, I'm sorry. I'm going to cut you off. I don't know if you know, but we don't see your presentation. I do have to cut us off because I hope you tell us more in the breakout room. Because this session is going to die and we have to move into the coffee rooms. I myself have a lot to say about what everyone said. So I want to thank everybody